Uh, Hello, pre-university long fiction students. Welcome back from your Easter break. You have hopefully by now finished reading William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying. That was the assignment for now. And so in today's lecture module, we will try to discuss some of the larger issues with respect to the novel. I'll also spend a little time talking about other issues for the class towards the end of this lecture and issues related to the term paper as well. So again, to recap, because we have been, with the exception of our class last week, last Monday, we have been separated and out of touch for a very, very long time. So just to remind you of a few things, Faulkner began writing the novel in October of 1929. Actually, he wrote it while he was working at a power plant. He was working on the night shift at the power plant at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, and he was basically feeding coal into these, ovens that needed to be stoked. And when he was finished doing that, he had this freedom to write, and he sat through the night and stayed up and writing the book. He wrote it very, very quickly. It took him approximately 6 weeks. You may notice, if you're attuned to history, that beginning it in October of 1929 happens to coincide with the great stock market crash of 1929. Actually, he began it, I believe, the day before the stock market crashed. I think the date was October 25th. And he, as I said, he wrote it straight through, finishing it in January of 1930. That might be relevant because one of the issues of the book portrays the lives of poor white farmers in rural Mississippi, and certainly economic oppression or economic difficulty, let's say, is a relatively prominent theme in the book. Certainly, many of the Bundren's actions are predicated on the fact that they are very poor. And so, for example, when Jewel and Darl decide to make a delivery of lumber, even while their mother is on her deathbed, that is clearly influenced by economic choices. Similarly, many of the situations that confront them on their efforts to get Addie to Jefferson in order to bury her are also complicated by their somewhat precarious economic situation. So that's something to keep in mind as a backdrop to the story. There are a whole number, if you think of the 1930s, there's a whole sense during that time of this oppressive economic reality. You have the Dust Bowl, and you have a whole number of great literary works considered to be, Depression-era literature, probably the greatest one being John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, about a family from Oklahoma that needs to go to California in order to try to find work farming. But probably Faulkner's As I Lay Dying could be also put into the canon of some of the great Depression-era literature. So that's one of the backdrops. Now, I think probably the first place we should go today would be to briefly summarize what happens in the latter stages of the book. If you'll remember, our lecture last Monday focused on the chapters, the intruding chapters in the middle of the book, where in sequence Cora, Addie, and Reverend Whitfield narrate chapters. And as I said, this is a very jarring break with the narrative flow of the book, because at that time the Bundren family is en route to Jefferson in order to bury Addie. But suddenly the narrative stops, and we have Cora discussing some of her moral qualms about Addie's behavior, and particularly her behavior with regards to Jewel. Then we have Addie's chapter, which is probably the single most important chapter in the whole book, just because it tells us so much about her and so many of the hidden secrets that are lurking in this family. And of course, the big one being that she had an illicit affair with Reverend Whitfield many, many years ago. And the result of that is that Jewel, her son, is actually not Ance's son, but is in fact the child of Reverend Whitfield. This is something that does not appear to be known to anyone except possibly Darl. We can talk about that perhaps a little bit later. But Darl, as we remember earlier on, has this prescient knowledge about things. He seems to know things that he shouldn't know. As we've mentioned numerous times, he is the one who narrates the chapter of that describes Addie's death, the moment of her death, and the episodes surrounding her death. That's rather ironic because he is at that time not present. So the fact that he is the narrative voice for that suggests something in the part of Faulkner with respect to what we should see with Darl. And so this secret has been kept, and suddenly it is exposed to us when Addie talks about her behavior. She talks about her history, her backdrop. We know she was a school teacher. We know she was quite unhappy. We know that she becomes a young woman. She is sort of constrained by society's expectations for her, and so she ends up seeking a husband, and she ends up marrying Ance. Now, if you've been reading the book, you should be aware that Ance is kind of a shifty character, not a very morally virtuous one. He's quite lazy. He seems to be taking advantage of everyone. Those images of him are compounded as we move towards the end of the novel. Certainly, where our feelings about him are probably, again, compromised. And so in light of her union with Ance and her accepting him as a husband, which she repeatedly mentions, and so I took Ance, almost as if this begrudging acceptance of her plight forced her to do it. She didn't have too many choices, perhaps, but then clearly she grows disenchanted within her marriage, and she ends up seeking some adventure outside of her marriage with Ance, and that adventure takes the form of an affair with Reverend Whitfield that is kind of dramatic, dynamic, passionate, probably. And she ends up having a child as a result of it, and then she ends the affair. There are a number of very, very important issues alluded to and laid out in that particular chapter. Addie has she expresses her distrust of words, and sort of how words are expressed and what they mean becomes a very prominent theme in the book. We'll come back to look at this. I'll probably have you all doing some work in coming class periods on your own with certain themes from the novel, and that would be one of them. Obviously, there's something ironic about a person distrusting words being conveyed in a novel, which is basically a story told in the form of words. So that's one important aspect of that. We also learn Addie's kind of calculating attitude about her children. We understand what she expected or what she didn't expect from motherhood, and then how she's somewhat deceived by the realities that she finds within the life of the married couple. And so she becomes quite disenchanted. First, she gives birth to Cash, then she gives birth to Darl, and by then she's already kind of had enough of motherhood. Of course, she's going to have numerous other children still in the coming years, and she presents to us a rather complicated and convoluted calculus with regards to how she sees motherhood, and in particular her engendering of these various children that she has. She sort of presents them to us as some justification in her head about why she has these kids. Obviously, the theme of motherhood is also very thoroughly focused on through the character of Dewey Dell, who is, as we know, pregnant. That's a secret that she has. You may have noticed already there are a lot of secrets in this book. It's another theme that we'll focus on in sometime soon, and certainly Dewey Dell's secrecy of her pregnancy and her desire to obtain an abortion dovetails quite interestingly with Addie's attitudes about motherhood, maternity, and the plight of women within the book. We see that with numerous other characters. Cora, Rachel, and are among the other characters who have perhaps less important roles, but important roles nonetheless in defining the perspective in the book on the place of the women in society, and particularly with regards to their role as mothers. So after we have Addie's narration of her chapter and our understanding of some of the issues plaguing her while she was alive, as I mentioned, this chapter has a little bit of a connection to the issue known as Captiveosses from epic poetry, which is a descent into the underworld. And we have the voice of the dead intruding into the living. In epic poetry, that typically gives insights into things we couldn't know, usually whether it's Odysseus or Aeneas or whoever the epic hero is that descends into the underworld. They end up coming back with special knowledge, privileged knowledge that they wouldn't have had otherwise. That effect is the same here. In one of the upcoming class periods, we will be looking at some of the issues of the heroic, epic being heroic poetry. We'll be looking at some of the themes that connect Faulkner's novel to the epic. Obviously, we've mentioned before, the title is taken from a quote from Agamemnon in Book 11 of the Odyssey. So obviously, just from there, we know that there's some level of link. And so Addie's chapter adds another layer to that. Her chapter is followed by a chapter narrated by Reverend Whitfield. Again, I mentioned this last class. Whitfield is based on a historical figure, George Whitefield, often sometimes pronounced Whitfield, who was a religious man originally from the United Kingdom who ended up coming to the United States and started these sort of revival tent, enthusiastic kind of exemplary behavior and often very very dynamic speaker, charismatic speaker, and a fundraiser. He's working in a tradition that I think in the South, in the southern United States, you have these, now the contemporary version would be these televangelists, these people who preach on TV, and they have a very large following, and they tend to be very wealthy often because people give them lots of money. Whitfield had that character where, as I said, Benjamin Franklin had mentioned, if you go see him speak, leave your wallet at home because he's going to end up with most of your money. Now, Whitfield in the novel is a character that we don't see very much. In fact, the only place we've seen him earlier in the book was when he came to bless the Bundren home when Addie died. This chapter that we see is coming from then. Basically, he's on his way to go to the Bundren household because he's worried about Addie being on her deathbed and possibly confessing her sin, the affair that she had with him. Now he's going over it in his head, and he's having this extended discussion with God about what he should and shouldn't do. And then he realizes that as he confesses on his horse, going towards the Bundren's house, and then he finds out that Addie has in fact already died, and so he doesn't have to have this last moment intervention to protect himself or her or whoever he might be protecting from that kind of uncomfortable truth. So he shows up and convinces himself that in fact by confessing his act to God, he was also confessing it to aunts and whoever else, and so he is in principle off the hook morally. Religion becomes kind of an interesting issue in this book. Religion was something that Faulkner was preoccupied with because, as you probably are aware, the southern United States have this kind of a very virulent form of evangelical Christianity. It's typically not Roman Catholic. It's usually Protestant, very often Presbyterian. And in fact, I have a quote from Faulkner when people had asked him about the importance of religion in some of his novels, and he mentions that basically it's a response to the influence of a violent form of the Protestant religion on politics and on the economy of the country. So he's reacting to that. So we often see in the book, we have a couple characters who have a very decidedly religious tone to them. Obviously, Reverend Whitfield would be the most important one. He's supposedly a religious man, although we do know that he had an extramarital affair with Addie. So his morality, his moral judgment, let's say, could be held in question. The chapter that precedes Addie's monologue is narrated by Cora Tull, and she's also a very religious figure. And we start to realize that she's also somewhat of a hypocrite because of the way she talks about judging people, and that you are not, it's only up to God to judge people, is what she tells Addie, while in fact the whole point of her chapter is that she is judging Addie and deciding that she's not Christian enough. So there's kind of this ironic reversal. You may have noticed when you were reading this, if you were attentive, that those two characters are the two most pointedly religious characters in the book, and they seem to be ethically suspect. So you could probably extrapolate from the way that they're portrayed in the book that Faulkner may have a somewhat negative effect of negative opinion, of people that are too overtly religious. So in the end, Reverend Whitfield would certainly fall into that category, a religious man who's somewhat immoral, and certainly we see him as, when he makes his decision to not confess because he's presumably already confessed, you can see him as slightly two-faced and morally compromised as a character. So those three chapters, those very, very important central chapters in the book, now out of the way, we move back into the narrative flow of the novel. And just to remind you, because it's eons ago that we were last there, what has happened is that the Bundrans have departed on their journey to Jefferson, which in principle shouldn't be such a terrible journey, but it was delayed at the outset due to Darl and Jules' delivery of lumber, and then the broken wheel on their wagon. And so they took a couple days before they could actually get started. Then there was this torrential storm, almost a biblical type storm, that washes out all the bridges. And when they're trying to cross the river, where there's a bridge that's still in place, but it's somewhat flooded, they try to cross with the wagon. They have an episode, and the wagon tips over. Their mules are killed. Addie's coffin flies into the river, into this torrential flowing river, and Cash's leg is broken. And in the end, they do get the coffin across. Jewel is the one who tracks down Addie's coffin, brings it to them. They need to then go and find a way to get another team of mules. They're all pooling together their resources. This is a case where Ants is very, very self-serving, because we know that Ants has one of his main objectives of taking the trip to Jefferson is, well, his stated main objective of taking the trip to Jefferson is because he's promised Addie, he's made a solemn vow to Addie that he would honor her wish to be buried with her family in Jefferson. And so whenever anybody approaches them during their trip to Jefferson, he makes mention of that fact that he's really being a good husband, doing the best that he can in order to live up to the promise that he made for his now deceased wife. Obviously, we learn early on that for him, an almost equally important issue is that he wants to get a set of teeth, going to the town where he can presumably find a dentist. And it's been an issue throughout the course of the novel that he has this hangdog look, and that his mouth looks kind of saggy and open because he's lost a bunch of his teeth apparently. And so now he wants to go to Jefferson so that he can get the teeth, and that he can then eat normal food like a man, like a normal man. He's been complaining about this throughout the novel. Now, of course, in order to get those teeth, he's been kind of cadging money here and there. And it seems that many members of the family have some minimal level of resources. And of course, Ants is always portrayed to us as someone who is, lazy, not very hardworking, and also very happy to take take advantage of the generosity and what's often seen as the Christian generosity of those around him. So Ants makes sure that he can get the most from everybody else, giving the least of himself. The term that's employed repeatedly in the novel is beholden. He says, I would not like to be beholden to anyone. And beholden, as we've mentioned previously, means to have a debt, to be indebted in some way. So someone does something for you, to be beholden to them means that you have to make some effort to reciprocate, to return the favor that's been done for you. And so Ants's actions are typically an effort to avoid that debt, to avoid being indebted, morally imposed on someone else. The only problem with that is that he seems to take advantage of their generosity and just doesn't seem to see fit that he should also reciprocate. So when someone helps you, you help them. He says, I'm not beholden, but we see Tull doing things for him. We see Armistead, we see all sorts of people making efforts to help the Bundrans. They pity them in a certain sense. They're watching them on their way to make this journey to Jefferson, and they see that they're in delicate circumstances. And so most of their neighbors, because this is a rural community where people know one another and people understand, and there's kind of this sense of community solidarity, because of those things, there's usually an effort to help them, but Ants doesn't seem to acknowledge it. And so he takes advantage of people's generosity without reciprocating. We've seen this previous to our break when we were working in class. We had looked at a couple places where people are offering to help the Bundrans, and he politely declines without realizing that he's being rude to them, and also that he does, in fact, require their hospitality. So the circumstance of the death of the mules requires some kind of action on behalf of the Bundrans, and they have to find a new team of mules. And so Ants is busy trying to cull money from everybody within the family. Dewey Dell has some money, Cash has some money, and of course the big issue, Ants is going to, I believe, pawn one of his seed cultivators or some farm machinery that he has. And the last resource that the family has is, of course, Jules' horse, which we've seen earlier. Previous to the chapters with Addie, we had the narration when Darl tells us of the story of Jules going out and working at night in order to get this horse. And so this is probably one of the key instances in the story of some level of economic initiative. Jules has gone out and basically labored through the night for an extended period of time in order to help Lon Quick and his 40 acres, and the idea that he can basically, by working, he will be paid. And so what ends up happening is that Jules gets this wild horse, right? And the horse is seen as this very curious character. Again, in an upcoming class, we'll be looking at some of the animal symbolism in the story, and certainly Jules' horse and horses in general are very, very loaded with significance here. So anyways, Jules' identity is very, very closely attached to his horse, and as the sort of almost the ultimate sacrifice, Ants asks him to give up his horse in order for them to get a team for them to bring Addie to Jefferson. And so Jules ends up sacrificing his horse for that reason. So eventually they are able to continue on their journey, this odyssey, as we've said, connected both through the title of the book and through the image of this arduous, long, unfolding journey that they're taking to get to Jefferson. And then the extended nature of their trip starts to become more and more problematic. The key issue, of course, is that Addie's body has been in this coffin for days and days now, getting, out in the Mississippi summer heat. The body is starting to decay and it's starting to stink. And so pretty much everywhere they go, there's a very visceral negative reaction to their presence. And people at first don't understand what it is. Most of the people dismiss it, and they're sort of assuming when they see the Bundrens, because there's this network of kind of gossip, the small talk of a small town where people know what happened, and people know that Addie Bundren had died, and they assume that aunts and the family are going on some trip after the fact, and it's only later that people realize that they still haven't buried Addie. It's now over a week later, and they still have the coffin with them, and they're still trying to get there. There's certainly a rather farcical nature to the story. It becomes, picaresque, somewhat humorous, but it's a very, very dark humor. And obviously, again, relating to the animal symbolism of the book, one of the key things is that these vultures, these big birds that are carrion birds, birds that eat dead bodies, are following the Bundrens. So there's this macabre image, and very often Vardaman is the one who's most distressed by this, because very often when they wake up in the morning, when they're sleeping, depending where they are on the road, the vultures will be around, getting closer and closer to the coffin, sometimes perched on the coffin, frequently flying around in circles above them as they go, which of course is, vultures do that when they have a very acute sense of smell. So when they smell carrion, when they smell dead animals, they know that that's what they want to eat. And so this becomes this rather sinister image of these birds following the Bundrens as they gradually make their way to Jefferson. And so as this trip extends and keeps extending, there starts to be a sense that perhaps it would be better to end this. And of course, the key adherent to this idea is Darl. And one of the other actions that's a central plot element of the book is that while they are stopped at Gillespie's house and they are spending the night there, the coffin is in the barn overnight, and Darl sets fire to the barn in the hope of burning down both the barn and with it the coffin. Now, once again, Jewel is the figure who comes to the rescue here, and he, in this very dramatic scene, risks his own physical well-being and running into the burning barn and grabbing the coffin and single-handedly pulling it out and getting actually burns on his back. I've neglected another plot element, which I believe we talked about. I think we talked about it in our last video lecture, but I may be wrong about that. But when the wagon tipped over in crossing the river, the key issue that happened there was that Cash fell out of the wagon and ended up breaking his leg. In the process, he lost all of his carpenter tools. And so the episode right after the loss of the coffin and the loss of the team of mules as well in crossing the bridge, we have an extended sequence where Jewel and Tull, I believe, are the two who mostly go in and try to find all of Cash's tools. And eventually, after a period of time, they're able to recover them. But then Cash's leg becomes they try to set it initially. Doesn't work very well. And so they end up encasing it in cement in order to, which is basically the principle of a cast. However, they're not doctors and they haven't done it very well. They basically bought some cement powder, mixed it up, and poured it all over his leg. And so this is, again, a somewhat farcical situation, but it's also quite horrible situation. And so in the midst of everything else that's going on, Cash is getting more and more unwell. His leg is starting to swell and his toes are starting to turn different colors, and basically he's in danger of possibly losing his leg. So this is a backstory also to the extended drama of the Bundrens trying to get to Jefferson. And so eventually, at long last, after a number of other perhaps somewhat minor episodes, the Bundrens do make it to Jefferson. And the novel culminates with a series of somewhat strange scenarios. One of those is that Dewey Dell, who, as we know, is pregnant with a baby from her sexual relations with Leif early in the novel, that we know that Darl knows about, even though he wasn't there, and that Dewey Dell is profoundly resentful about. That's driving her. And so she has taken her nice clothes with her, and she goes into Jefferson, and she goes into a drugstore, and she asks who she thinks is the pharmacist, who is actually an assistant, to if he can help her with her abortion. She believes that she can buy some drug that will help her, a self-induced abortion, so she can get rid of her problem of her pregnancy. The person that she speaks to is actually an immoral young man who decides to try to take advantage of her, and he does take advantage of her. He tells her that she should come back in the evening, and he's going to give her a potion that will help her, and he ends up raping her, basically. He has her come back and convinces her to have sexual relations with him that will supposedly undo the act that got her pregnant, and then she's to drink this powder dissolved in water that will help her get over this. So that's one backdrop to the story. That's the resolution of her problem, or the non-resolution. Again, there's something disturbing about that in a lot of ways. We could have that discussion. Rape is not a topic that should be treated lightly in any way, shape, or form. And in this book, it's kind of dealt with, I don't want to say humorously, but it's dealt with in an ironic and strange way. And so Dewey Dell's naivete and her gullibility allow her to be taken advantage of by this guy. And so that's one element of the end of the story. Probably the most jarring element regarding the book's end is that as they get to Jefferson, they need to go and they need to dig a hole, a grave for Addie. And so they stop somewhere, and Ants goes in and asks to borrow some shovels, and he borrows them from a woman who, it's not clear the circumstances, and so they go and they dig the grave for Addie, and they bury her. And then when they finish with the burial, they come back, and Ants returns the shovels to the person that he borrowed them from, and he then presents this duck-shaped woman as his new wife. So this becomes a completely absurd, to some extent, definitely unexpected situation at the end of the book. So Ants has taken this woman, and presumably, it's not clear to us from what the book tells us. It's not clear if there's any kind of previous situation there or not. We don't know. She's only referred to as a duck-shaped woman, and in the context of the book, he introduces her as the last lines of the book. It's Cash and Jewel and Vardaman, and Dewey Dell, Pa says, kind of hangdog and proud too, with his teeth and all, even if he wouldn't look at us. Meet Mrs. Bundren, he says, and that's the way the book ends. Of course, one other key plot element. I apologize, I've been sort of jumbling some of these. I haven't been entirely chronological. That's sort of in keeping with the spirit of the book, perhaps, because the book is not entirely chronological either. We talked about this early on with the element of the stream of conscious narrative. But one of the other big effects in the book, is that after Darl set fire to the barn, to Gillespie's barn, we become aware that it's him. Initially, we're not that aware, but apparently Vardaman sees him, and he tells Dewey Dell, and Dewey Dell tells other people that basically she, of course, has an ulterior motive. She has a certain amount of hatred for Darl. We've seen that earlier in the book. Actually, perhaps next week we'll come back and look at some specific passages from the book that allow us to infer certain things in the style that Faulkner writes them. But Dewey Dell is very, very resentful of Darl due to the fact that he is aware of her pregnancy, and she feels in some way judged by him, and probably rightly so. Darl seems to have a little bit of a negative attitude about Dewey Dell and her behavior, certainly. Darl is a very curious figure throughout the book. So anyways, Darl being responsible for the burning of Gillespie's barn. And of course, one should maybe make mention of this, because this is a theme that comes up a couple of times. Perhaps some of you in your Introduction to College English class, you may have come across this story. Faulkner was also a great short story writer, and he wrote a number of very, very important short stories, and one of them is entitled Barn Burning, and it's the story of a pyromaniac who burns barns. Basically, he's actually his name is Snopes, so he's connected to the horse that Jewel owns, who has come from Snopes family as well. There's a minor connection to this book. But the thing is that burning a barn in Faulkner's world is a very, 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 very serious crime. I mean, obviously arson is a serious crime, but for the people of these stories, the barn is kind of more than just a building on a farm. Barn is the repository of your wealth. It's a bit like your bank. If you're a farmer, you store up hay and you store up the things that you grow all year, and the barn is the place where you store them. And so burning the barn is kind of this cataclysmic act. In a sense, you're economically decimating a person. And so Darl's choice to burn the barn here as kind of almost collateral damage is pretty damning in a certain sense. Now, obviously, Darl's actions were undertaken in order to kind of put an end to the quest to bring Addie to Jefferson. And you could argue, many people might argue, that there's a certain logic to it. Now, obviously, for Gillespie, he doesn't see it that way because he lost his barn. And so Dewey Dell, in announcing Darl's responsibility for this, ends up that the Bundrens have to make a decision, and either they are going to reimburse Gillespie for the barn, which it's not possible for them to do because they clearly are completely at the limits with regards to their economic means. They don't have the money to do that. And so the compromise is that Darl will be committed to an insane asylum. And so basically Darl is going to the state house for the criminally insane in Jackson. And that is the way that Darl ends in the story, that he is taken away by these agents and put on a train and brought to Jackson. And Darl kind of comes unglued in the end, and he seems like he's somewhat crazy. Now, there's a whole lot there are a lot of different readings on the behavior of the characters, and perhaps we can look at that in a coming class period when we look at the issues of epic and heroism and heroic poetry, is to who actually behaves in a heroic way. In fact, that was one of the term paper questions dealing with heroism and anti-heroism. So in the end, Addie does get buried. Ants finds a new wife, the new Mrs. Bundren. Dewey Dell is deceived, and she thinks she's getting something that will help her with her pregnancy when in fact she is not. Darl is committed to an insane asylum. He's no longer with the family. Cash actually has the graphophone that the duck-shaped lady, the new Mrs. Bundren, has. Cash also eventually gets the cement taken off of his leg, and it almost costs him his leg, tears off a whole bunch of skin. And so that's kind of the way the novel ends, not a terribly conclusive ending to the book. So what I've discussed with you over the last half hour or so covers much of the second half of the novel, what you were asked to have read for today's class period. Also, obviously, the term paper assignment is coming due this evening. You need to turn in your papers by midnight. I don't think we've really had the time to go over the questions related to this particular novel, As I Lay Dying. I have seen very, very few drafts of people writing on As I Lay Dying, so I'm not sure to what extent many of you, I have fielded, I don't think, hardly any questions at all for people writing on As I Lay Dying. The vast majority of you seem to be writing on Pride and Prejudice. So just to kind of remind you, basically the novel, the term paper for the class was originally due for April 1st, due to the closing of school on March 13th, and those ensuing 3 weeks where we were not in school and where we did not have any learning activities. The date was postponed, and the novel paper is now due at midnight, 11:59 tonight. So you should turn in your essay. Now, in the course outline, I mentioned at the beginning of class that I do not accept electronic transmissions. Obviously, that is not possible under the circumstances. So I would ask you to please make sure that your document is an attached Microsoft Word document. I do not want PDF files, and I do not want screenshots of your computer. Those are not very easy for me to read. Word has the advantage that I can insert comments into the text very, very easily, and so I will take your essay. If you can title your file with your first initial and your last name, and then term paper, that would be the preferred way of listing your term paper, because if you just list it as term paper, when I save that file, there are a whole lot of other term papers out there. So if you can save your file with the first letter of your first name and your entire last name, and then term paper, that would be greatly appreciated. You can send it to me via Mio. I do not have, don't think I set up any kind of Dropbox or anything on Leia, so you can send it to me via Mio as an attached document, and I will immediately get to work grading these, so I will probably give them back to you. Normally, in a class context, I would typically hand them all back. I will probably grade them in the order that I receive them, so if you send me your paper earlier, you will probably get it back earlier. If you send it to me very early, you may get it back very, very early. And then, as I mentioned previously, there was a decision that I had to make. Going forward from today, we do not have very, very many class periods. So there was the decision of whether we wanted to read a third novel which would have been quite rushed. As I said, we've now just finished Faulkner, and now we will spend at least 2 or 3 class periods working on various issues related to the novel. There is a final written assignment to be done on this novel that we will do in an in-class setting. In other words, I will give you a question at 8:30 one of the mornings of our class period, and I will ask you to submit it to me at 10:15 that day. So please be attentive to that. Please watch your inbox so that you're aware when that assignment comes, because if I don't have it that day, I won't be grading it. And it's pretty clear to me that a lot of you are not watching the modules and are not doing the work that you should be doing for this class. I'm not going to chase after you and forcing you to do things, but if you don't do the assignments when they're asked to be done, there will be consequences for that. So if you have any questions about that sort of thing, you can feel free to ask me. And of course, we will have today at 9:30, we will have a Zoom video conference question and answer period. So you are certainly free to participate in that and ask any questions you would like to ask. Presumably, our first priority would be questions related to Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, things that you understood, things that you didn't understood, explanations you would like to have. That would be priority number 1. Priority number 2 would certainly be issues related to the term paper assignment. That assignment was given a very, very long time ago, so I'm very okay with extending the deadline due to the circumstances we found ourselves in. But I'm also feel that you should have had ample time to work on it. I know I saw a good number of drafts before school was canceled on March 13th. So there are some of you who've been working on this for over a month. If you were assiduous and proactive and took initiative when the assignment was made, you were certainly in a position to do that. I've given feedback on full drafts to a good number of you. And so, it shouldn't be 11th hour scramble to write the paper. There are certain limitations. I know that you do not have access to the library, so I know that there are issues related to books. But for those of you who have contacted me about source material, I've usually been, I hope it's been fulfilling for you, rewarding for you, those of you who have asked me for source material, because I have an enormous quantity of PDF scholarly articles on these novels. I've been teaching, all of these novels for a good number of years, and I've accumulated quite a quantity of material on them. So depending what you're writing on and what you're looking for, I can certainly direct you that way. Now, obviously, today, with the assignment due this evening, it's a little bit late to be sending you out PDF files for 27-page articles that you're going to read and somehow integrate into your essay that's going to be turned in roughly 12 hours. So that might be a little bit a day late and a dollar short, as the expression goes. But certainly, if you have questions, you can feel free to pose them in our Zoom meeting, which presumably you will have had time to watch this in its entirety, and you will receive an invite into your Mio inbox. So, without further ado, I will end this video module, and I will look forward to speaking to you all very shortly through the Zoom call. So, have a nice day.